Hey guys, just based on some of the things I was seeing on the quiz, I I want to make a few things more clear. First of all, I want you all to remember that this is a function. A function has inputs and outputs. So when we're talking about sine of x and cosine of x and graphing them, um, we're plugging in certain angle measures. We're getting out certain numbers, right? So like, let's look here at our original y equals sine of x, right? We have infinite number of angles we can plug into this, right? I want to just talk about the main ones that are on the axes because those are the numbers that are going to give us either the minimum or the maximum or the midline, right? So for instance, if x equals 0, when I take the sine of 0, we know that the sine is the y coordinate in our unit circle, and my answer is 0, right? The sine of pi over 2 is 1. The sine of pi is 0. The sine of 3 pi over 2 is -1. And the sine of 2 pi is 0 again, right? And so if I were to graph these points, I would get an angle of 0 gives me a sine of 0, right? At this point, an angle of pi over 2 gives me a sine of 1. And then pi comma 0, and 3 pi over 2 -1, and 2 pi 0. And when I connect these points, there obviously are points in between. I just didn't plot them all. And it does this, right? I did one full cycle. I got all the way around the unit circle one time. That's why the period is 2 pi. The reason we call this a periodic function is because if I kept going, I would repeat with the same values and it would look the same. And if I went negative, if I go this way, negative pi over 2, I get -1. Negative pi, I get 0. Negative 3 pi over 2, I get 1, right? And so it repeats in that direction too. Like that's what period is. The numbers I'm plugging in is not period. Those are input values. They are angle measures. And so what happens when we have a more complicated equation like this? Obviously, we have talked about amplitude and midline and all of that, and I hope you can look at that and tell me what those things are, but I want to be more specific about what's happening. I don't think I've done a good job of explaining this. Literally, we are saying, what about when the angle is 0? What if I plug that in for x? What would the y equal, right? So I'm going to write that over here. What if my equation said y equals 4 times the sine of 0 minus 3? Well, the sine of 0, that's right here. I would get 0. So this would say 4 times 0 minus 3. 4 times 0 is 0, and 0 minus 3 is -3. And so I would plot a point at 0, -3. Then I go to the next point, x equals pi over 2. My equation would say y equals 4 times sine of pi over 2 minus 3. What's the sine of pi over 2? We're just following order of operations, right? Do the inside first. Sine of pi over 2 is here on my unit circle. Sine is the y. So I would get 1 for sine of pi over 2. What's 4 times 1? It is 4. What's 4 minus 3? It is 1. And that is why my maximum is up here at 1. Because whenever I have pi over 2 for sine, that's always going to give me my maximum, right? What happens when I plug in pi? I'll do that right here. 4 times sine of pi minus 3. The sine of pi is right here, and that's 0. So I have 4 times 0 minus 3. What is 4 times 0? It is 0. 0 minus 3 is -3, and I'm back here. Let's keep going. So here's -3. Next, 3 pi over 2. 4 times the sine of 3 pi over 2 minus 3. What is the sine of 3 pi over 2? It's the y coordinate at this angle, and I get -1. So I get 4 times -1 minus 3. 4 times -1 is -4, minus 3 is -7. And I cut myself off here. So on my table up here, when x is 3 pi over 2, my y is -7. When I graph that, at 3 pi over 2 here, I get a y of -7. So look what our graph's doing here, right? It started at -3. It went up to 1. It came down to -3. it's going down to -7, and then I have 2 pi. When I plug that in, y equals 4 times the sine of 2 pi minus 3. What's the sine of 2 pi? It is 0. What's 0 minus 3? It is -3. And I get back to where I started, and that's why -3 is my midline. It's because every time I plug in 0 or pi or 2 pi, I'm getting 0 for the sine, and then I subtract -3 to get to my midline, right? Why is the max at -3 plus 4 more? Well, because when I plug in something like pi over 2 for x, the sine is 1. Then 1 times the amplitude is 4. And then 4 minus 3 is the 1, right? And of course, this keeps going as well. It repeats, and I can do all the same things. So let me show you one more example with cosine, just to kind of make sure I'm being clear here. So here, let's look at first just the parent function. What if y equals cosine of x? We know cosine on the unit circle is my x coordinate. So when my angle is 0, my cosine is this value right here. So if x in this equation is 0, my cosine is 1. And that would give me this point, 0, 1. When x is pi over 2, we're here. The x coordinate of the unit circle is cosine, so my cosine is 0, and I have this point, right? When my angle is pi, my cosine is -1, and I'll scroll down just a little bit so we can see that better. So I have this point here, and then 3 pi over 2, we're here. My cosine is 0. And at 2 pi, we're back at the beginning. I get 1 again, right? So here is my curve, right? It's the same curve as sine, just starts at a different place, right? And again, it carries through that cycle multiple times, or infinite times actually, right? So again, what if I have a more complicated equation? All we're doing is plugging in x value first, and then following order of operations. So I'll do that first one right here. Y equals 2 times the cosine of 0 plus 5. What is the cosine of 0? We already know it's right here. It's 1. So I get 2 times 1 plus 5, which is 7. So the y coordinate, like read this specifically, y equals 7 when x, right, is 0. So that means my graph starts right here. What about when x is pi over 2, right? Well, we get cosine of pi over 2 is 0, and 2 times 0 is 0. So my y equals 0 plus 5, which is 5. Next, 2 times the cosine of pi plus 5. What's the cosine of pi? It is -1. And -1 times 2 is -2, plus 5 is 3. So when x is pi, when x is pi, y is 3. I haven't been writing these numbers down, excuse me. Okay, right here. What about when I get down to 3 pi over 2? I have 2 cosine 3 pi over 2 plus 5. What's the cosine of 3 pi over 2? It is 0. So 0 plus 5 equals 5. And that brings me back here. And last, you already know what's going to happen, I hope, right? We get 2 times the cosine of 2 pi plus 5. That means my cosine value is 1. And when I multiply that by 2 and add 5, I get a y of 7, and I'm back at the top, right? So, again, the reason I'm talking about this is because I'm getting the impression that I wasn't clear about where these numbers are coming from. It's not just like some random rule I made up, right? This is coming from the actual values. When you plug in an angle, you get out a ratio, a number between -1 and 1 always. But that -1 or 1 or 0 or whatever number has to then be multiplied by the number in front and added by this number at the end. And that's why my midline is at 5. It's because every time this equals 0, 0 plus 5 will give me 5. That's the middle. Why is the max going to be 7? Because when the cosine, the biggest cosine can ever be is 1. But then you multiply it by the number in front, which gives you 2. And then I add it to the midline to go up. And then obviously if this is -1, I go down 2. And that's how I get to the minimum. So I think this may help you with understanding where max and min is coming from, and how they're related to these numbers, and why it's not just this number in front that tells you the max. That's how far you go from the midline, because you're literally going to add this number to that number to find the max, and you're going to subtract that number from the midline to find the min. And also, in terms of where it starts, whether it starts at the max or the midline or whatever, it goes back to what you get when you plug in an angle of 0. Okay. And that's going to be important as we move on to what we learned today that's new. So before we go, I want to show you one more thing. Just one more clarification of a question I got a few times about right before the quiz. Okay, so here I have two different graphs graphed at the same time. Their equations are almost identical, right? This first equation is y equals 3 times the sine of 2x plus 1. The second graph is y equals 3 times the cosine of 2x plus 1. So they both have a 3 in front, which hopefully we know by now that means the amplitude is 3. They both have a plus 1 at the end, which means that the midline is 1. And they both have a 2 on the inside. That means the period should be 2 pi divided by 2. My b is 2. So my period should be pi, because what this really means is my graph is traveling through its cycle twice as fast, which means the period is half as long. Okay, so let's look at this kind of one at a time. So if I'm looking at sine of 2x plus 1, right? It starts in the middle. I keep saying that. So why am I saying that? It's because where it starts is when x equals 0. So if I take an x of 0 and I plug it in to this equation, I will get the sine of 0. What's the sine of 0? 0. What's 0 times 3? 0. What's 0 plus 1? 1. And that's why there is a point here at 0, 1. Then it starts going up. And if I trace this graph, we can see that it goes up to the maximum, back down to the midline, down to the minimum, and back up to the midline. And when does it go through that whole cycle? It takes it pi degrees. And then what if you were to keep going, right? It's going to repeat itself infinite times. How many times will it repeat itself within this distance of 2 pi? It just went through 2 full cycles in 2 pi, and that's because there's a b here of 2, right? And so what if I compare this to the cosine graph? My cosine graph has all the same information. The difference is it goes back again to what happens when x equals 0, because that's the first point that I'm going to plot. That's why I'm saying I start there. So if I take x equals 0 and I plug it in right here, then cosine of 0 is 1. 1 times 3 is 3. 3 plus 1 is 4. So when x equals 0, y equals 4. That is why it starts at the maximum, because the biggest that the cosine part can ever be is 1. That happens when x equals 0. So this gives me a cosine of 1. Then you multiply by this number 3. Then I add 1 to get to 4. And again, from there, everything should follow along. It goes through its period. It gets back to where it started after pi. That's why the period is pi. That's also because we take 2 pi and we divide it by this number in front. And when 2 pi is divided by 2, the 2's cancel and your answer is pi. So you're making that too complicated and trying to flip stuff. You only have to flip something if you're dividing by a fraction. 2 divided by 2, there's no copy dot flip or keep change flip or whatever the crap you guys say. Just divide 2 by 2. It's 1. And my answer is 1 pi. That's the period. So anyways, I thought it might help to see these two graphs right next to each other so you can see what I mean by starting at the middle, which is what sine does, and starting at the max, which is what cosine does. And it's because of what happens when you plug in x equals 0. So sorry to take up some time, but I hope that clarified some things. And I'll just post a separate video for today's lesson.